Pinewood Greens sat on the outskirts of a mid-sized American city, a collection of homes that radiated uniformity and order. With manicured lawns and pastel hues on every facade, the neighborhood felt like the embodiment of the suburban dream. Each property boasted a picture-perfect driveway, a modest front yard dotted with symmetrical shrubs, and a mailbox that conformed to the neighborhood's color scheme. If you arrived at Pinewood Greens for the first time, you might think you had stepped onto the set of a family sitcom, where everything was pleasant and gently choreographed. Behind the curtains of these tidy homes, however, a subtle tension pulsed beneath the apparent calm. Pinewood Greens was governed by an influential homeowners association known as the HOA, which established rules intended to preserve harmony and property values. In theory, these regulations covered matters such as lawn maintenance, trash disposal schedules, and restrictions on building modifications to preserve a consistent architectural look. Yet in practice, the HOA's influence was far-reaching, and its representatives could make the simplest activities feel policed. No one exemplified the HOA's micromanaging streak quite like Brenna Addison, though behind her back, most neighbors referred to her simply as Karen. Brenna was a woman in her early 50s, with a perpetual look of stern efficiency etched into her face. She carried herself with an almost militaristic bearing, shoulders back, chin up, and her eyes scanning for the faintest signs of transgression. Whether it was an incorrectly placed garbage can or a stray weed poking up through sidewalk cracks, Brenna would note the infraction in her ominous black notebook. She had memorized the HOA bylaws to a fault and believed it her sacred duty to enforce them with unwavering rigor. Brenna's house itself stood as a testament to her methodical nature. The lawn was trimmed to an even half-inch, the flower beds showcased precisely spaced blooms, and her front window displayed a sign that read, "Maintain our neighborhood standards." On the HOA board, she was known as the strictest member, one who pushed for more fines and more rules, all in the name of protecting property values. She often referred to herself as the eyes and ears of Pinewood Greens, and this self-appointed role gave her confidence. When she walked the sidewalks in the early mornings, binder in hand, everyone else avoided eye contact. It wasn't that they feared her physically. They feared the power of her sharp tongue and her ability to pounce on the smallest breach of HOA protocol. Against this backdrop, the Parker family moved into Pinewood Greens. Rebecca and James Parker, along with their 2-year-old toddler, Luke, were a warm and easygoing trio. They'd come here looking for a safe, friendly environment to raise their son. Initially, the tree-lined streets and uniform houses seemed charming, a promise of stability. Little did they realize that by choosing Pinewood Greens, they had also chosen to dwell under the unwavering watch of Karen Addison. The Parkers had scarcely settled in when Luke's second birthday arrived. Among the gifts he received was a bright red push-along car. Luke immediately took to it, toddling around the house with the plastic steering wheel grasped firmly. The little car had squeaky wheels, a cute smiley face sticker on the front, and a small horn that tooted with a gentle press. To Luke, it was the best thing in the world, his precious, buzzy car, as he liked to call it. Rebecca and James found the squeaking endearing, though their new neighbors sometimes heard the sound echo through the building's corridors if Luke ventured into the hallway. When Luke was restless or the weather was foul, the Parkers allowed him to ride the little car indoors. After all, it wasn't large, and the hallway was wide enough to accommodate passing neighbors. Rebecca always made sure Luke stayed to one side, especially near their door, so as not to block anyone's path. For a few weeks, things went without incident. Some neighbors, upon encountering Luke in the corridor, smiled and waved at the adorable toddler scooting along in his bright red toy. Life in Pinewood Greens appeared peaceful, and Rebecca was beginning to think they had made a good choice in moving here. She'd even chatted amicably with a few residents who had children of their own, forging the beginnings of new friendships. But Brenna, Karen, wasn't quite so charmed. Each morning on her self-designated inspection walks, she passed the Parkers' unit. If she spotted Luke's little push-along car parked in the hallway, a grim frown marred her features. She would peer at the car as though it were a disease-ridden object. She grumbled about eyesores, about potential hazards, and about how quickly one exception could spiral into the entire hallway becoming a repository for personal items. One evening, as Brenna scrolled through the HOA bylaws, She made mental notes of any clause that might remotely apply to the push-along car. Technically, the rules prohibited obstructions in common areas, particularly items that posed a safety or fire hazard. Yet Luke's small toy hardly matched that definition. That didn't stop Brenna from highlighting lines such as residents shall refrain from leaving personal belongings in shared spaces if said belongings create impediments or reduce aesthetic standards. She circled words like impediments, unsightly, and public thoroughfare, determined to build a case. Early on a cloudy Tuesday morning, while the Parkers ran out to pick up groceries, Brenna Addison seized her chance. She had observed that Luke's push-along car was left momentarily in the hallway, neatly pushed to the side, but still in her line of sight. Concluding that she had the moral and legal high ground, Brenna marched to the Parkers' door and knocked. When no one answered, her frown deepened. She took out her phone and snapped several pictures of the push-along car from different angles, presumably for evidence. Then she lifted the little car, tucked it under her arm, and spirited it away to her home. It was an almost comical sight. This stern woman in her pressed slacks lugging a bright red toddler's toy across a pristinely mowed lawn. Brenna's face was resolute. In her mind, she was saving Pinewood Greens from descending into chaos. She carried the toy down into her basement, which was filled with neatly labeled boxes and meticulously stacked supplies. In one corner, she had an old wooden shelving unit, and she decided the push-along car would stay there until she had sorted everything out with the HOA board. When Rebecca Parker and little Luke returned from their errand, they stepped into the hallway expecting to see the push-along car waiting for them. Instead, the space was empty. Luke immediately noticed, tugging on Rebecca's pant leg and saying, "Car? Where car?" Rebecca's heart sank. She double-checked around the corner, behind the hallway's potted plant, and even at the opposite end of the corridor. No luck. Bewildered, she asked a passing neighbor if they had seen a toddler's toy. The neighbor shook their head sympathetically, having no information to offer. Rebecca was mystified. Who would steal or remove a plastic toy? And for what purpose? She phoned her husband at work, explaining that Luke's toy was gone. James shared her disbelief and suggested that perhaps building maintenance had moved it. Rebecca decided to investigate that possibility, heading to the property manager's office. The maintenance staff, however, denied touching any children's belongings. Instead, one employee shrugged and said, "You might want to ask Ms. Addison. She's always monitoring what people leave around." The name Ms. Addison barely registered in Rebecca's mind at that point. She recalled receiving a few of the official HOA newsletters signed by Addison, but she'd never had a personal run-in with the woman. It seemed implausible that the head of the HOA's enforcement committee would want to confiscate a child's push-along car. Nonetheless, Luke's toy remained missing, and she had to get to the bottom of it. That evening, James Parker arrived home to find Luke looking forlorn and Rebecca venting her frustration about the missing toy. "I tried calling the HOA office," she told her husband, "but I only got a voicemail. I left a message, though, explaining the situation and asking for anyone who might have removed the toy to return it." James, pacing the living room, was incensed that a neighbor would do something so petty. He said, "What kind of person just snatches a toddler's pushcar? This is ridiculous. I'm going to see if Ms. Addison is at home. She's apparently some big shot on the board. Maybe she knows what happened." But the Addisons' lights were off, and no one answered the door. Meanwhile, Luke kept toddling to the hallway, pointing to the empty space where the push-along car used to be. Each time, he'd look at his parents with confusion in his eyes. Rebecca's heart ached. She tried to distract Luke with another toy, but it wasn't the same. That push-along car had become his favorite. As the days passed, a swirl of rumors developed within Pinewood Greens. A few neighbors whispered that they had seen Brenna Addison marching away with the child's toy. Others mentioned that Addison had a track record of odd, authoritarian behavior. She once complained about a neighbor's porch light being too bright and threatened a citation for light pollution. Another time, she posted a photo of someone's lawn that hadn't been mowed to her standards. Some residents believed Addison's controlling nature stemmed from her desire to maintain the neighborhood's pristine facade, but most simply found her meddlesome and exhausting. Before long, it seemed likely to everyone that Brenna was behind the push-along car's disappearance. Angry mutterings sprang up in online forums dedicated to Pinewood Greens. Some parents expressed fear that Addison might take more extreme actions if left unchecked. Finally, Harriet Morris, a long-standing HOA board member with a calmer, more diplomatic style, stepped in. Concerned about the disturbance this incident caused, she proposed an urgent board meeting to clarify the rules around children's items and to address the Parkers' complaint about the missing toy. On a humid Thursday evening, a group of about 20 residents gathered in the community center for the special HOA session. The room was lined with folding chairs, and at the front sat a long table where the board members placed their binders and pens. Harriet Morris, who typically tried to find amicable solutions to neighborhood disputes, took the seat in the middle. To her left was Dave Carstairs, a semi-retired accountant with a calm demeanor. On her right sat the notorious Ms. Addison, her expression a mask of self-righteous purpose. The meeting commenced with Harriet reading aloud the Parkers' written complaint. Their toddler's push-along car had been taken without permission and had yet to be returned, despite attempts to contact the responsible party. Harriet summarized the rumored involvement of Ms. Addison in the confiscation. She looked at Brenna, raising an eyebrow. "Brenna, do you have any statement on this matter?" Brenna cleared her throat. "Indeed, I do," she said, her voice measured. "There is a rule in our bylaws stating that residents shall not leave personal items in communal walkways, lobbies, or corridors. This includes, but is not limited to, furniture, sports equipment, and large toys that could obstruct passage. I observed the Parkers' item in a shared hallway. It was left there multiple times, in violation of this rule. As an HOA representative, I took it upon myself to remove said item." A few gasps sounded from the residents. One mother whispered to another, "She's talking about a toddler's toy like it's contraband." Harriet gave a gentle rap on the table. "Order, please." Rebecca Parker stood, holding Luke in her arms. "It's a small push-along toy," she began softly but with a tremor of resentment in her voice. "We never intended to obstruct the corridor. We were always mindful to keep it near our door. Also, Ms. Addison, if you had a concern, you could have knocked on our door or left a note. Instead, you just took the toy, and we've been left with a confused child who's missing his favorite thing." Harriet added, "Yes, Brenna, it does seem like your approach was a bit heavy-handed. Why not simply discuss this with the family first?" Brenna pursed her lips. "Because the Parkers were evidently ignoring the rule. I knocked, but no one answered, and I decided that immediate action was warranted to preserve the integrity of the building. The corridor is a communal area, not a storage closet." James Parker responded, "That toy is barely larger than a vacuum cleaner. It's not storage. And we have never blocked emergency exits or inconvenienced anyone." From her seat in the front row, an elderly resident named Mrs. Donaldson spoke up. "I've walked by their hallway many times, and the toy was never in my way. Not once," she said, shaking her head. "This feels like an overreaction." Murmurs of assent rippled through the crowd. Harriet turned to Brenna. "Brenna, do you still have the toy in your possession?" With a stiff nod, Brenna replied, "Yes. It's in my basement storage. I plan to return it once we clarified the guidelines. But it's important to send a message. Allowing personal toys in the corridor sets a precedent we cannot ignore." The exchange continued for nearly half an hour, with residents chiming in about times Brenna had threatened fines for minor infractions. Others lamented the atmosphere of tension that had grown under her watchful eye. By the end of the meeting, Harriet and Dave looked overwhelmed by the outpouring of discontent. Harriet announced that the board would deliberate privately and issue a directive by the next day regarding the toy's return and any revisions to the bylaws. Meanwhile, in the community center parking lot, a cluster of residents gathered after the meeting, discussing what they saw as Ms. Addison's authoritarian streak. Parents with young children were especially riled, concerned that if Brenna confiscated one toy, she might escalate her intrusion into family life in the future. A father of 3 remarked, "Next, she'll be telling us we can't keep strollers in the foyer even temporarily. Where does it end?" A wave of frustration permeated Pinewood Greens. Online, a petition emerged, demanding that the HOA board limit Ms. Addison's authority or remove her from her post altogether. Stories poured in from exasperated neighbors who had faced Addison's scolding or official-looking citations left on their door for the smallest perceived infractions, like wind chimes that exceed acceptable decibel levels. Brenna, for her part, remained impervious to the anger swirling around her. She genuinely believed she was doing the neighborhood a service by strictly interpreting and enforcing the rules. Whenever she saw a complaint online, she rolled her eyes, muttering about how no one appreciated her efforts to keep property values high. In her mind, the threat of letting one small toy remain in the corridor was akin to opening the floodgates for bigger, more unsightly items. At the same time, Harriet and Dave engaged in multiple late-night phone calls, trying to diffuse the tensions. They recognized the need for a balanced approach. Most residents agreed that walkways shouldn't be cluttered, but also that a small child's toy, carefully positioned, did not represent a real hazard. The meltdown over this incident highlighted a deeper problem. Brenna's hostility was alienating people and making the HOA seem more like a punitive body than a supportive one. The following day, Harriet delivered the board's decision. Ms. Addison was to return the toy to the Parkers within 24 hours. Meanwhile, the board would draft a clarifying guideline that explicitly permitted small children's items in communal areas, provided they didn't block exits or major thoroughfares. Harriet typed up the statement, which read, "Small children's push-along or ride-on toys may be momentarily kept in communal hallways, as long as they do not pose safety issues or significant obstruction. Residents are encouraged to store these items indoors when not in active use." A copy of this statement appeared on the community bulletin board by noon, and a digital version reached residents via email. Brenna was incensed. She felt that the board had caved into emotional appeals instead of respecting the letter of the law. However, her colleagues pointed out that the rules never specifically banned a toddler's car. They only mentioned obstructions. A bright red plastic push-along toy, only 2 feet long, hardly qualified as a major impediment. Furthermore, Harriet reminded Brenna that by confiscating the toy without due notice or a hearing, she had overstepped her authority. With a stiff jaw, Brenna acknowledged the directive. That evening, she watched from her window as the sun set, the sky turning soft shades of pink and orange over pinewood greens. Her normally ordered mind was in turmoil. She felt betrayed by the very HOA she had served so diligently. Still, a direct order was a direct order, and she had no choice but to comply. Early the next morning, she marched to her basement, retrieved the push-along car, now gathering a thin film of dust, and placed it on the Parkers' front porch with a curt note, "Returned by HOA directive. For future reference, please respect the common area regulations." Rebecca and James discovered the car on their porch when they took Luke out for a morning walk. The toddler squealed with delight, hugging the red plastic hood as though reunited with a long-lost friend. Rebecca felt relief and frustration in equal measure. Yes, the toy was back, but Brenna's curt note implied she still believed the Parkers were at fault. That same day, Harriet popped by to apologize personally on behalf of the board. "I'm so sorry it became such a fiasco," she told the Parkers. "We're putting explicit guidelines in place so that incidents like this don't happen again." Luke, oblivious to the complexities, zoomed up and down the hallway, squeaking his wheels and tooting the little horn. This time, no one dared to complain. Some neighbors passing by clapped or waved, congratulating the toddler on getting his car back. The tension, however, had not fully dissipated. A sense of resentment lingered, especially for those who felt that Brenna had gone too far in confiscating a child's property. A week later, as a gesture of support, a few friendly neighbors chipped in to buy Luke an even bigger toy, an electric mini-trike with a small battery-operated engine that made a quiet hum. It came in a shiny cobalt blue, with a miniature LED headlight and playful decals. When the neighbors unveiled it in the courtyard, Luke nearly exploded with excitement. He hopped onto the seat, pressed the button, and squealed as the trike lurched forward at a gentle speed. James and Rebecca laughed, touched by the generosity. The neighbors offered wry smiles, remarking that if Brenna had intended to prevent children's toys from populating the neighborhood, her actions had ironically inspired them to double down on child-friendly fun. News of the push-along car saga spread throughout Pinewood Greens and beyond. Residents in other nearby communities, upon hearing the story, shook their heads at the extreme nature of HOA politics. Pinewood Greens had always been known as a strict but orderly place. Now, it was infamous for having a board member who confiscated a toddler's toy. On social media, the situation was described by some as peak Karen behavior. with memes circulating about Brenna's unwavering glare and her obsession with dangerous plastic cars. Meanwhile, Harriet and Dave tried to mitigate damage to the neighborhood's reputation. They clarified that Ms. Addison was not the sole voice of the HOA and that many residents were kind, family-oriented, and rational. Still, the whispers persisted. Some prospective homebuyers began asking realtors if Pinewood Greens was the place where that lady took a toddler's toy. Yet, ironically, the fiasco brought many of the residents closer together. People who had never spoken beyond a casual greeting now found themselves united by their frustration over Brenna's overreach. Block parties became more frequent, with neighbors setting out picnic tables on the communal lawn and letting children run about safely. Outdoor movie nights, once a rare occurrence, started happening monthly. In these gatherings, residents could air their shared grievances, joke about the toy thief, and celebrate the sense of unity that had blossomed in response to adversity. Despite the friction, Harriet believed in the possibility of reconciliation. She recognized that Brenna's zeal, while misguided, came from a genuine desire to maintain a pleasant, well-ordered environment. Perhaps, Harriet reasoned, if Brenna redirected her energy into constructive projects rather than punitive measures, she could use her penchant for detail for the community's benefit. One afternoon, Harriet approached Brenna in her impeccable front yard. Brenna was tending to her hydrangeas, painstakingly removing any wilted petals. Harriet started gently. "Brenna, I know the last couple of weeks have been difficult, but we need your organizational skills for the upcoming fall festival. Could you help us coordinate the event?" Brenna pursed her lips. She was still nursing resentment over being chastised for the toy incident. "I'm not sure if the board even wants my help anymore. Everyone made it clear they don't appreciate my strictness." Harriet mustered a warm smile. "That's not true. We value structure, but we also need balance. You have a great eye for detail. Let's channel that into something positive. The festival is an annual tradition, and we could use your assistance with permits, vendor scheduling, and ensuring everything is up to code." Brenna hesitated. She recognized that Harriet's invitation was partly an olive branch and partly a subtle attempt to keep her from interfering in more petty matters. Still, the notion of showing her neighbors she could be constructive, rather than just punitive, held some appeal. Finally, she exhaled and said, "All right, I'll give it a try." Weeks passed, and the annual fall festival approached. Brenna threw herself into planning with her characteristic fervor. She made sure every food vendor had the proper license, that the fire department's guidelines for the barbecue pit were respected, and that no extension cords crossed pedestrian walkways in a manner that might pose a tripping hazard. In her quest for perfection, she sometimes clashed with neighbors who preferred a more relaxed approach. But Harriet acted as a buffer, smoothing over disputes. When the day of the festival arrived, Pinewood Greens felt more alive than ever. Families meandered through rows of booths featuring homemade crafts, baked goods, and games for children. A bouncy castle had been set up on the community lawn, and the squeals of delighted kids filled the air. Even Luke, with his new electric mini-trike, rode around, under close supervision, thrilling at the festival's sights and sounds. Brenna manned the main registration table, checking in vendors with a no-nonsense efficiency. Her posture was rigid, but the corners of her mouth hinted at a smile when she saw how smoothly things were running. As people passed by, many of them gave her polite nods or brief greetings, acknowledging her role in making the event possible. Brenna couldn't help but feel a cautious sense of satisfaction. Perhaps she could be recognized for something positive after all. Late in the afternoon, Harriet approached Brenna, offering a cold lemonade. "Great work, Brenna," she said. "Everyone's having a wonderful time, and it's thanks in large part to your attention to detail." Brenna accepted the lemonade with a nod, her eyes scanning the festival grounds. "I just wanted everything done properly," she responded. "I suppose that's all I've ever wanted, for things to be in order." Harriet nodded gently. "I understand. Order has a place, but so does flexibility. Let's strive for both." Though she didn't express it outright, Brenna experienced a small epiphany. Seeing children run around the booths without a care, hearing neighbors laughing together, made her wonder if she'd been too rigid. She spotted Luke Parker, happily zipping around on his mini-trike, and reflected on how the entire push-along car incident had ignited so much animosity. Perhaps there was a middle ground between unbridled enforcement and utter chaos. In the weeks following the festival, a subtle but discernible change swept through Pinewood Greens. While Brenna still kept a vigilant eye on the state of lawns, garbage schedules, and communal spaces, she no longer pounced on every minor infraction. Instead of issuing citations, she sometimes began conversations, knocking politely to explain a potential issue and offering suggestions rather than threats. Residents, in turn, noticed her mellowing attitude and grew more inclined to meet the HOA halfway on concerns like cluttered porches or unkempt yards. For the Parkers, life became more peaceful. Luke continued playing with his original push-along car and occasionally took the mini-trike for a spin in the hallway. Rebecca and James kept those items inside most of the time, making sure not to provoke any further tension. They even invited Brenna to Luke's third birthday party, a gesture of goodwill that surprised and touched Brenna, though she politely declined, citing a prior commitment. Still, the invitation alone symbolized a thawing in the once frosty relationship. True to her word, Harriet formalized the newly updated HOA guidelines. It stated explicitly that small children's toys could be used in communal hallways as long as they did not pose a hazard or block access. The document emphasized common courtesy, respect, and communication as guiding principles, words that Harriet hoped would help shape Pinewood Greens into a more welcoming community. On a sunny Saturday afternoon, several months after the tumult over Luke's toy, neighbors gathered for a casual potluck on the lawn near the community center. Tables laden with homemade dishes and refreshments lined the area, while children played tag or rode scooters around the perimeter. Brenna arrived with a homemade pie, surprising everyone with her newfound willingness to participate socially. People welcomed her contribution, offering thanks and friendly conversation. While she still had her occasional stern moments, she no longer emanated the same overbearing intensity. Luke, squealing in delight, zoomed by on his push-along car, and everyone turned to watch the grin on his face. Catching Brenna's eye, he waved a tiny hand, and she mustered a small smile in return. It was a simple gesture, yet it encapsulated how far things had progressed. No more secret confiscations, no more locked basements filled with contraband toddler toys. Instead, Pinewood Greens had become a community where a child's laughter was seen as a blessing, not a nuisance. That evening, as the potluck wound down, Harriet made a small toast. Lifting her cup of lemonade, she said, "Here's to our neighborhood, to our families, and to finding the balance between rules and compassion. May Pinewood Greens continue to be a place where we respect each other and learn from our mistakes. Cheers." Dozens of cups clinked in response. And in that moment, the tension that once threatened to fracture the neighborhood seemed to melt away. Even Brenna, Karen herself, raised her cup, acknowledging that while perfection and order were important goals, a sense of community, warmth, and a willingness to accommodate life's little joys were equally vital. Over time, the tale of Brenna Addison confiscating Luke Parker's push-along car faded into a neighborhood legend. New residents heard it as a funny anecdote about HOA dramas, while older ones recalled it as the catalyst that brought them closer together. Pinewood Greens continued to thrive, its neat and tidy streets now infused with a more welcoming energy. Kids played freely, neighbors greeted each other with genuine smiles, and the HOA's rules, though still enforced, became anchored in mutual respect rather than intimidation. Brenna, for her part, never fully lost her fervor for order, but she did grow more empathetic. She found new ways to channel her penchant for meticulousness, organizing community events, overseeing landscaping projects, and crafting guidelines that balanced neatness with neighborly goodwill. Though the nickname Karen lingered in some corners, it was used more affectionately than before, a nod to her transformation and her willingness to adapt. As for Luke's push-along car, it remained a cherished possession, outlasting the drama that had once swirled around it. Sometimes, neighbors would spot him scooting around, or they'd see it parked neatly outside the Parkers' door. They'd exchange knowing grins, remembering how that tiny plastic toy had sparked a pivotal change in their community. A small conflict, resolved with kindness and compromise, had ushered in a new era of unity for Pinewood Greens. In the end, the story served as a reminder that living together requires patience, empathy, and a shared commitment to harmony. Rules and guidelines can keep a community running smoothly, but it is compassion and understanding that make it truly thrive. And so it was that in Pinewood Greens, a place that might have become a battleground of petty infractions, a push-along car ultimately paved the way toward a happy and more cooperative future for everyone.